Walk into any watch store, and you'll see different choices. Rows of different brands, different histories, different price tags. It feels like competition between brands, and you feel like you have different options. But what if most of those options aren't real? Because behind the dial, behind the logo, behind the story you're being sold, the majority of these watches are powered by the same two movements. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The $3,000 watch, the $1,200 watch, even the entry luxury pieces people argue about online, sometimes they're running on the exact same mechanical heart. So what are you actually paying for? Because the deeper you go into brands owned by groups like Swatch Group and Richemont, the more the industry starts to look less like a battlefield and more like a system. A system designed to look competitive while being tightly controlled. And once you understand how that system works, you'll never look at a watch the same way again. Let's break it down. Part 1. The engine room. In 2002, the Swiss watch industry nearly had a heart attack because of one brand. Nicholas Hayek, chairman of the Swatch Group, arguably the most powerful person in Swiss watchmaking, announced that ITA, the Swatch Group's movement manufacturing arm, would be stopping delivery to outside companies. Just like that. He said it openly. To a Swiss newspaper, "We no longer intend to produce or deliver to third-party watchmakers." The industry lost its mind. Because at that point, ETA wasn't just a supplier. It was the infrastructure. Roughly 80% of all Swiss mechanical watches were running on ETA movements. Brands had been buying from them for decades, not because they had to, but because ETA's movements were reliable, well-priced, and everywhere. The ETA 2824 was everywhere. It showed up in watches from German microbrand newcomers. It showed up in Swiss dress watches at $3,000. It showed up in tool watches worn by divers who beat the hell out of their gear and expected it to keep running. If you owned a Swiss watch before 2002, there was a very good chance it had an ETA heartbeat. And you probably never thought about it, because why would you? What Hayek was proposing wasn't just a business shift. It was leverage, deployed openly. Think about what that actually meant. One man, one company, with the ability to tell the rest of the Swiss watch industry, including Richemont, including independent brands, including companies with 200 years of heritage, that the hearts they'd been putting in their watches were no longer available. That they had, maybe, a few years to figure something else out. The Swiss Competition Commission eventually intervened. ETA was ordered to keep supplying movements through 2011, with a gradual phase down. But the damage to the industry's psychology was already done. Everyone now understood the exposure. Everyone understood who held the structural power, which is how Sellita became the second name you need to know. Sellita had been around since 1950, mostly as a quiet assembler, putting together ETA movements on contract. They'd been so good at it that Sellita was reportedly assembling more ETA movements than ETA itself at certain points. Then ETA brought assembly in-house in 1990, cutting Sellita off. And then in 2002, Hayek made his announcement, and Sellita saw what everyone else was too stunned to act on, an opportunity. The patent on ETA's most popular base movement, the 2824, had expired in 2002. So Sellita built their own version. Same geometry, same beating frequency, 28,800 vibrations per hour. Same dimensions, so brands could swap one for the other without touching their cases. They called it the SW200. Crucially, even the key components, the hairspring, the escapement parts, came from the same Swatch Group subsidiary that supplied ETA, Niverox, which means Sellita's independence was always partial. They were building the rebellion out of the empire's spare parts, but it worked. Sellita now produces about 1.5 million mechanical movements per year, with 800,000 of those being the SW200 alone. Brands like IWC, Tag Heuer, Oris, Raymond Weil, Shin, and Hublot have all used Sellita movements, sometimes transparently, sometimes less so. Sellita deliberately keeps its name off the dial. They told Time and Tide watches that they stay in the background deliberately, so the brand stays the star. You were never supposed to know it was them. So here's where it stands. ETA supplies the Swatch Group's own brands: Omega, Tissot, Hamilton, Longines, Blancpain, Breguet. Sellita supplies almost everyone else who can't or won't make their own movements. Two companies with a combined grip on somewhere between 60 and 80% of Swiss mechanical watch production, depending on whose numbers you use. That's not really competition. That's a shared plumbing system with very good marketing on top. The next time you're standing in a watch store, weighing two watches from different brands at different prices, telling yourself you're making a considered choice between independent visions, you might be. Or you might be choosing between two people who ordered from the same restaurant and just plated it differently. And those two names, ETA and Sellita, are still just the first layer. There's something deeper running underneath all of it, and most watch buyers have never heard of it. Part 2. The invisible third company. Here's the thing nobody outside the collector community wants to talk about. It's not just movements that come from central suppliers. It's the tiniest component inside the movement, the one that determines whether your watch runs accurately at all. The hairspring. A hairspring is a coil of metal wire thinner than a human hair, wound into a flat spiral, beating back and forth at 6 beats per second inside the escapement. It's the reason a mechanical watch keeps time. Get the hairspring wrong and nothing else matters. The case can be hand-finished. The dial can be stunning. The movement plates can be beveled and polished to mirror quality. Without a consistent, accurate hairspring, you have a beautiful object that drifts minutes per day. Niverox makes the hairsprings for the entire Swiss watch industry. Niverox is a subsidiary of the Swatch Group. A forum post on Watch You Seek from 2012 put the number at over 95% of Swiss mechanical watches, all relying on one company for the component that determines whether the watch actually tells the time. And in 2012, Nicolas Hayek made it explicit, publicly warning the industry that Niverox was under no obligation to keep supplying brands outside the Swatch Group. Same move, different component, same leverage. The consequence of this isn't abstract. Consider what the independent watch collector community figured out at the time. Sellita had positioned themselves as the movement manufacturer for everyone who couldn't get ETA. The ETA alternative. Freedom from Swatch dependency. Except Sellita's movements use Niverox hairsprings. The clone movement, the one built specifically to give the industry an escape route from Swatch dominance, still runs on Swatch Group parts. The rebellion was built on the empire's infrastructure. Rolex had seen it coming earlier than anyone. In the early 2000s, they started developing their own hairspring alloy internally, a niobium-zirconium compound that turned blue during heat treatment. They called it parachrom. The purpose wasn't just technical improvement, it was independence. Rolex wanted to be able to look at Niverox and say, "We don't need you." By the time Hayek started making threats about supply restrictions, Rolex had already built the exit. Patek Philippe followed, developing their own silicon Spiromax hairspring from 2005. Grand Seiko's parent Seiko built their own supply chain. Hairsprings, mainsprings, cases, dials, movements, all in Japan. The most independent watch companies in the world all made the same calculation at roughly the same time. You cannot build a genuine watch empire if the most critical component comes from a competitor's subsidiary. Most brands couldn't make that calculation. The expertise required to manufacture a hairspring, 2 milligrams of metal, wound to tolerances measured in microns, reproduced consistently at millions of units, took Niverox decades to develop. You don't replicate that in 5 years or 15. Even many in-house movement makers still source their hairsprings from Niverox, including, for a long time, some of the most prestigious names in watchmaking. Patek Philippe used Niverox springs before their own silicon option was ready. Even the movement decorating the back of a piece, costing $50,000, might contain a hairspring that came off the same Niverox production line as the one in a watch, costing $500. The Swiss-made label does not tell you any of this. It tells you where things were assembled. It says nothing about the supply chain that made assembly possible. But the movement duopoly and the hairspring monopoly, those are structural facts the industry at least acknowledges. The third layer is the one that actively uses a different word for what it is. Quick one. Do you know what movement is inside your current watch? Not the brand, the caliber. Drop it below, if you do. Part 3. The in-house lie. This is where things get specific and uncomfortable. IWC is a Swiss watch brand founded in 1,868 inches, Schaffhausen. They make serious watches. Pilot's watches, diving watches, complicated dress pieces that collectors actually respect. They are owned by Richemont, the luxury group that also owns Cartier, Vacheron Constantin, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Panerai, and Baume & Mercier, among others. In 2021, IWC released the Pilot's Watch Mark XX with a movement they described on their website, in their press materials, to journalists across the watch media as an in-house caliber. The caliber 32111. What the press materials didn't volunteer, that movement was made by manufacturer horloger Val Fleurier, a company that is not IWC, a company that is wholly owned by the Richemont Group, the same parent that owns IWC. Val Fleurier is Richemont's internal movement manufacturing arm. It makes movements for multiple Richemont brands simultaneously. The same base architecture that IWC calls an in-house caliber also beats inside Panerai watches, and Baume & Mercier, and it traces its DNA back to a movement originally developed for Cartier. Introduced in 2014 as the 1847 MC. Each brand gets a different rotor, different finishing, sometimes adjusted specs, but the underlying movement? Shared, group-sourced, designed by one company and distributed through multiple brand identities with different names stamped on it. Worn & Wound, one of the more honest watch publications, acknowledged the problem plainly. What I, and I think other watch collectors, want to know is not how the brand defines it, but how and where it's actually made and by who. They pointed out that in-house, manufacture, and in-group are phrases that brands define for themselves elastically, and that the definition can stretch to cover almost anything. IWC's response, essentially, is that Val Fleurier is wholly owned by Richemont, therefore its output is in-group, and in-group is close enough to in-house to use the term. The Watch You Seek forums spent weeks dissecting this. One poster made an argument that's actually harder to dismiss than it sounds. The Tudor Canisi movement that Tudor calls manufacture is only 40% owned by the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. Val Fleurier, at 100% Richemont ownership, is arguably more in-house than Tudor's celebrated movement. And yet Tudor gets praised for transparency, while IWC gets side-eye. The definitions are genuinely blurry. That's partly the point. But Panerai's case is harder to defend on any definition. In 2021, a blogger named Periscope published a post about Panerai's new P 9200 chronograph movement. The brand had implied it was in-house. They traditionally used the prefix OP on externally sourced calibers, and the P 9200 didn't have it. Journalists wrote it up as an in-house movement. Periscope pulled it apart and found something different. The P 9200 was a standard ETA 2892, a two-base with a Dubois Depraz chronograph module, not a Val Fleurier derivative, not a group movement, an ETA bought in bulk at somewhere around $75 a unit. That post spread through the collector community like a slow fire. It hit Panerai forums hard because Panerai collectors tend to be particularly loyal. They know their watches, they know the brand's history, they care. Finding out that an in-house movement was an ETA with a module felt like a betrayal of the relationship. What nobody mentioned in the mainstream coverage, the Panerai OPXXXIV, used in multiple Luminor Du and submersible models, was also a Val Fleurier movement, made for Baume & Mercier first, marketed as Baumatic, then routed to Panerai and IWC as well. 3 brands, 1 movement, 3 different stories told about it to 3 different sets of buyers. Then there's the IWC Pilot's Watch Mark 18th, the one where IWC's own website specified the movement should have pearlage finishing. Independent watchmakers, who opened the case back, found a raw Celita SW 300. No pearlage, no extra finishing. A bulk-purchased Swiss movement, undecorated. The Sellita SW300, for reference, can be purchased for around $75 wholesale. The Mark X Tint sold for somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000. None of this necessarily makes it a bad watch. The Sellita SW300 is a reliable movement. The watch might keep excellent time and last decades. But there is something worth naming about the distance between raw Sellita bought in bulk and the way this watch was sold. The gap between those two realities is the brand name lie, not the quality, the story. And the watch press, for the most part, repeated the story without the disclaimer. Hodinkee reviewed the IWC Mark XX and referred to the caliber 32111 as in-house, even after the Valfleurier origin was publicly established. Perescope noted it directly. Hodinkee, of course, continues to refer to this movement as in-house, even though they should know better by now. But we know who they work for, do we not? That last sentence says more about the watch media ecosystem than it does about any individual brand. This is why forums matter. Watch You Seek, Watch Crunch, Reddit's R, Watches. The people on those sites are not paid to maintain relationships with PR departments. They have no reason to be careful about what they say. When a collector posts a teardown and finds a raw Sellita where the spec sheet promised decoration, that post stays up. It doesn't get softened in the edit. That's where the real watch education happens, not in the glossy spreads. There is one more piece to this. The one that doesn't just change how you think about buying, it changes how you think about owning. Drop a brand in the comments. Which one surprised you most? We'll talk about it. Part 4, The Servicing Trap. In 2015, Swatch Group sent a letter to independent watchmakers. It informed them that going forward, spare parts for Swatch Group brands, Omega, Tissot, Hamilton, Longines, Rado, and the rest, would only be available through authorized service centers. Independent watchmakers who wanted to keep servicing these watches would need to meet a list of equipment requirements. Specific ultrasonic cleaning machines from an approved manufacturer, a specific water resistance tester, brand-specific tools, a recognized watchmaking qualification, a dedicated polishing room with motor and extraction, a fridge for lubricants, 2 light sources on the microscope. The cost of meeting those standards ran to tens of thousands of pounds for a small workshop. Many independents simply couldn't afford it. Picture the watchmaker this hits hardest. Not the one who services Rolex and Patek and can charge whatever the market bears. The one in a market town somewhere who has a regular customer base, who knows every watch that comes through the door, who charges fairly and turns things around in 2 weeks. He's been servicing Omegas for 30 years. He knows the 2824, the way a mechanic knows an old engine. He's fast, he's good, he's trusted. After 2015, he can't get parts. He can order from an approved Swatch Group account if he jumps through the accreditation hoops, months of paperwork, equipment investment, inspections, or he sends the customer to a Swatch Group service center, where the service costs more, takes longer, and arrives at a faceless facility rather than someone who recognizes your face. Cousins UK, one of Britain's largest watch parts wholesalers, the supplier most independent watchmakers had used for years to get Omega, Tissot, and Hamilton parts, fought it. They called it anti-competitive. They went to court. They published a statement saying they were vigorously engaged in court proceedings against the Swatch Group. The Swatch Group responded by launching its own action in a Swiss commercial court to have the court declare they hadn't broken competition law. Both things can be true at once. The Swatch Group had a legal right to control their distribution, and it was also, in practice, a mechanism for capturing service revenue that previously went to people they didn't control. The forums didn't pull punches. One Watch You Seek poster put it plainly. To get an account with Swatch Group is very expensive, and you have to jump through so many hoops, it's crazy. The amount you pay for a Swatch Group service, the time it takes, and the quality of work are not worth it. Find a decent independent. They will better all of the above. But the independents were losing the parts. Richemont followed its own version of the same logic. Their U.S. repair facilities consolidated to a single technical center in Fort Worth, Texas. You own an IWC Portugueser in New York. It needs a service. Your options are find a watchmaker who meets Richemont's accreditation standard, or ship your watch to Texas. Wait months. Pay the rate they set. It comes back in a generic box, and you've never spoken to the person who touched it. There's a particular kind of purchase decision this poisons in retrospect. The person who chose a Longines heritage over an alternative because ETA movements were straightforward to service, everywhere, affordable, no brand gatekeeping. That was once a legitimate reason to choose Swiss Mechanical. The serviceability was part of the value. It's not anymore. You didn't just buy a watch. You bought a long-term service relationship with a company that will determine what it costs to maintain that relationship for the rest of the watch's life. And they made that decision after the sale. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. Part 5. What actually stands alone? All of this raises an obvious question. Who isn't doing this? Rolex. Rolex makes its own movements. Their Parachrome hairspring, developed internally to bypass Nivarox. The Siloxy silicone hairspring, their own, developed for the Lady Datejust. Cases, bracelets, dials, all manufactured in facilities Rolex controls. The Wilsdorf Foundation, the private charitable trust that owns Rolex, has no external shareholders. Nobody is calling a quarterly earnings meeting and asking why margins aren't higher. No luxury conglomerate above them is setting brand priorities for the year. When you buy a Rolex, what's inside is a Rolex, not a Swatch Group component licensed for use in a case that says something else. Not a Val Fleurier architecture with a new rotor. Not a Sellita purchased at $75 a unit. The watch is exactly what the name claims. This is part of why the resale market behaves the way it does. Rolex holds value, sometimes increases in value, because the thing you're buying is clear. The story is accurate. You know what you own. Tudor sits in an interesting middle position. The Canisi movement company that supplies Tudor movements is 40% owned by the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. The arrangement is complex. But Tudor doesn't pretend it's something it isn't. They say where movements come from. That transparency is worth more than people give it credit for. Patek Philippe makes their own. Lange and Söhne, despite being owned by Richemont, manufactures their movements genuinely in-house in Glashütte, Germany. They don't route through Val Fleurier, and they're notably careful about not claiming things they can't demonstrate. Grand Seiko's parent, Seiko, built an entire vertical supply chain across Japan. Movements, hairsprings, cases, dials, straps. The Japanese version of independence. Constructed without the centralized choke points the Swiss industry allowed to form. These brands tend to cost more, sometimes significantly more. Part of what you're paying for, whether you recognize it or not, is the accuracy of the story being told about what you're buying. For brands that source openly, Oris, Shin, Christopher Ward, who tell you clearly what movement is inside and don't dress it up as something proprietary. The honest mid-tier choice is often undervalued. You're getting Swiss reliability at a fair price, with accurate disclosure. That's worth something. More than the premium charge to call the same movement something it isn't. The irony is that honesty is a selling point. Some buyers specifically seek out Sellita-powered watches because they know the movement is reliable, serviceable, and supported by an independent supplier. That's a real advantage, as long as the brand isn't charging you the price of an in-house caliber for it. The story the industry tells about itself is not false. Exactly. It's more like a very selective edit, and knowing what got cut changes everything. Part 6. The tier game and why it's actually clever. Here's where a little fairness is due. Because the picture isn't only dark. The Swatch Group's vertical integration didn't just create a monopoly. It created an ecosystem that may have saved Swiss watchmaking entirely. Go back to the 1970s. Quartz technology had arrived, and it was devastating the industry. A Japanese quartz watch cost $30 and kept better time than a Swiss mechanical costing 10 times that. Swiss exports collapsed. Brands went bankrupt. Entire towns in the Jura valleys, where generations of families had worked in watchmaking, faced the end of everything. ETA's consolidation, the absorption of dozens of failing Swiss movement makers into one industrial unit, is what rebuilt the production capacity that made Swiss mechanical watches commercially viable again. Without the scale, without the supply chain, without the ability to produce a reliable movement at a price point that a $200 watch could absorb, the Swiss mechanical watch industry probably doesn't survive the quartz crisis in any form that matters. The ETA 2824 isn't just a movement. It's arguably the piece of engineering that kept an entire cultural tradition alive long enough for people to fall in love with it again. Nivarox's hairspring monopoly looks sinister until you consider the alternative, a world where each brand had to develop and manufacture their own hairsprings, where the investment required pushed entry costs so high that only 5 or 6 companies could compete. The consolidation concentrated power, yes. It also concentrated expertise in a way that made quality consistent and accessible. The tier strategy inside the Swatch Group is real. You're being guided up a price ladder as your income and interest grow. Tissot is the on-ramp. Longines is the next step. Omega is where serious collectors start. Blancpain and Breguet sit above that in complexity and price. The brands aren't competing with each other. They're a progression, designed to keep you inside the Swatch family as your spending power increases. But here's the thing. It works because the watches at each level are genuinely good at their price point. The Tissot PRX is a legitimately excellent watch. The Longines Legend Diver earns what it costs. The Omega Seamaster is a serious piece of engineering by any honest standard. None of those conclusions change because the movements share a family tree, or because the hairspring came from a Swatch Group plant in La Chaux-de-Fonds. What changes is the framing. There is a difference between Swiss-made with an in-house movement and Swiss-made with an ETA derivative running on a Nivarox hairspring. Both watches can keep perfect time. Both might last 50 years. But the buyer who pays a premium for the first description deserves to know, clearly, which one they're getting. The pricing of premium often rests on the story as much as the substance. A watch that costs $4,000 more than a functionally equivalent watch is asking you to value something beyond functionality. Heritage. Craftsmanship. The idea that this specific caliber was born from this specific engineering tradition. When that story is elastic with the truth, when in-house means made by a different company our parent owns, the premium is at least partly being charged for a fiction. That doesn't make these watches bad. It makes the conversation around them less honest than it should be. A buyer who understands all of this and still chooses the IWC over the Seiko is making a coherent decision. He likes the design language. He accepts the group's supply chain. He knows the movement comes from Val Fleurier and considers that fine. That's a legitimate position. Nothing wrong with it. A buyer who chooses it because they genuinely believe it contains something that only IWC makes, built by IWC engineers, from IWC-developed technology. That buyer is making a decision based on incomplete information, and the brands are in no hurry to complete it. The incompleteness is built into the price. 3 companies. One producing the movement. One producing the heart of the movement. A third stamping different names on variants of the same thing and calling each one something proprietary. The engineering is real. The craftsmanship is often genuine, and the story around it is sometimes accurate and sometimes not. And the industry has very little interest in helping you tell the difference. There's a specific kind of buyer this lands on hardest, not the collector who already knows all of this. The person buying their first serious watch, saving up for something that feels like a step up, something with weight and history, something more than a battery-powered number on their wrist. They read the spec sheet. They see in-house movement. They feel the significance of that phrase without quite knowing what it means. And they make the purchase partly on the basis of a story that was written by the brand, about the brand, with no obligation to be complete. That buyer deserves better information. The brands know more than they're saying. Most of the journalists covering them know more than they're printing. The forums know. And now, so do you. If this changed how you think about a watch you already own, or one you're considering, drop which brand in the comments. That conversation is always more interesting than the one in the boutique. Also, like this video and subscribe. If you've ever looked at a watch's caseback and wondered what's actually inside it, the guide in the pinned comment is the one I wish existed when I was starting out. It covers what you have been wondering about, which brands are honest about who they are, and how to read the spec sheet before you spend. It'll save you from an expensive mistake. Probably more than one.